My name is Nathan Connolly. I also go by NDB Connolly in my written work. I am a professor here, an assistant professor, in the Department of History at Johns Hopkins University. I'm also the co-director of the Center for Racism, Immigration, and Citizenship, and a member of the executive board for the August Center of Africana Studies. I'm very happy to be at this event today at this time. This is an event that some were worried might not happen given the course of history. It was actually scheduled months in advance and by some cosmic act happened to coincide with the events of this week. So we are meant to be here today, I do believe. We are occupants of a moment and an event that is historical in a different way. It is the first forum on race in America that Johns Hopkins will host and run for at least the next year and hopefully longer. This series of events is the direct result of the ongoing conversations about race and racism that our students, faculty, and administration have been engaged in throughout the year. In the wake of tragic and untimely deaths and in the wake of longer, lingering problems, the losses of Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Rekia Boyd, Walter Scott, Freddie Gray here in Baltimore, and many others forces us to take action. Today's discussion is not intended to domesticate the issues, as discussions often do. It is the first step in a plan. And I ask that each of you approach this event in the spirit of planning and as the first step toward action, definitive, proactive action. Now, a couple of thank yous before I get out of the way and allow the proceedings to go forward. I'd obviously like to thank the Center for Africana Studies, which has been carrying the torch on these issues at the university for quite some time, as well as the Black Student Union, which has been carrying it for even longer. I'd like to thank the Black Faculty and Staff Association, President Ron Daniels, and our Diversity Leadership Council. I'd also like to thank Janice Bonsu, President of the Student Government Association, and Jacqueline Ferreira, who will be manning the mics this afternoon. So if you want to talk to us, you got to go through them, so be nice. My tag team partner for today's event is Dr. Debra Furr-Holden. Dr. Furr-Holden earned her Ph.D. at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. An epidemiologist, Dr. Furr-Holden is expert in the areas of drug and alcohol dependence, epidemiology, psychiatric epidemiology, and prevention science. Her research areas include methodological issues surrounding the design and evaluation of interventions, including sampling, program modeling, and innovative statistical and evaluation approaches. She also measures drug and alcohol abuse and discusses behavioral health inequalities. She's an expert in environmental approaches to violence, alcohol, and tobacco. That's a theme we'll likely hear something about today, the environment. And she has worked with local and national policymakers to improve data-driven decision-making and include health in all policies, thinking of health at all times and in all ways. Now, we are honored this morning to also be joined by the chief officer at the institution, President Ron Daniels. I'm going to introduce President Daniels, who will then give a few remarks, and I will come back and give you a sense of the rest of the occasion. Ronald J. Daniels is the 14th president of Johns Hopkins University. A law and economics scholar, he is author or editor of 7 books and dozens of scholarly articles. Before coming to Johns Hopkins, he was provost at the University of Pennsylvania and dean of the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto. Since taking office in 2009, President Daniels has focused his leadership on 3 overarching themes: enhanced interdisciplinarity, collaboration, individual excellence, and community engagement. So collaboration and interdisciplinary work are obviously the same. Today's event, with the help of Caroline Laguerre-Brown, Vice Provost for Institutional Equity, and Provost Robert Lieberman, comes in the spirit of collaboration and community engagement. It provides a platform for genuine innovation in the field of racial and economic justice. During President Daniels' tenure, the university has launched a series of multidisciplinary initiatives aimed at addressing some of society's most vexing issues, including gun violence, food deserts, and Baltimore City public school children's access to top-flight education. Indeed, the president has often said that Johns Hopkins is, quote, truly and proudly of Baltimore, unquote. I can think of no better time than right now to exhibit just how much this is true. Please join me in welcoming President Ron Daniels.
Thank you, Nathan, and good morning. When we conceived of this series, it was at a time when Ferguson, Missouri, and Staten Island, New York, were dominating the news coverage. These events raised painful and urgent questions about race and equality in America. And one doesn't have to look very far from this auditorium to see the sad legacy of intergenerational inequality and marginalization. But in truth, as Nathan indicated, when we planned this series, we had no idea whatsoever that our city was teetering on the edge of becoming a focal point for national, indeed international attention on these sadly all too familiar issues. Over the past 2 weeks, we've watched the simmering national issues explode right here in Baltimore with Freddie Gray's tragic and troubling death in police custody, and the destruction that ensued earlier this week in several neighborhoods across our city. But even in the midst of this trauma, or perhaps particularly in the midst of this trauma, we understand and seek to honor our university's role as a critical forum for open, rigorous, and searching exploration of the underlying sociological, economic, health, and cultural forces that have brought us to this moment. We gather here today in Baltimore, a city where nearly a quarter of our residents and a third of our children live below the poverty line, where the rate of violent crime is 3 times the state average, and where, even within city limits, the infant mortality rate is nearly 4 times higher for Black babies than for white. And so, while we are daily witnessing the flickers of our city's revival in so many different sectors, education, healthcare, arts and culture, tourism, we also know that there is much work to be done to ensure that the pace of revival continues and that its benefits are shared broadly and fairly across all of our community. The conversations that we will have here in Shrival Hall will add to the richness and nuance of the debates that have been raging throughout our dorm rooms and our classrooms over the past several months. And I'm really delighted that Nathan and Debra Furr-Holden have agreed to participate in this event. I'm also pleased and honored that Ta-Nehisi Coates, one of America's most thoughtful and provocative and insightful commentators on race, has returned home to his native Baltimore to join us. Though the logistics of this event, as you know, have presented rather some challenges, we recognize the critical importance of this moment and this conversation. I want to thank you all for being here today on short notice and echo Nathan's thanks to the many individuals and organizations that have helped coordinate this first event in Johns Hopkins Race in America series. And let me conclude by acknowledging and thanking our provost, Rob Lieberman, without whose leadership this series would never have come to be. Rob is, to his great regret, out of the city because of a family obligation, but he was very instrumental in ushering this series to life. Thank you so much for being here.
Today's event will be in about 3 parts. There'll be an address of 20 minutes. There'll be a conversation for 30 minutes here on stage, and then we will open up the discussion to you for 30 minutes. Now the part we've been waiting for. Ta-Nehisi Coates, born in Baltimore, Maryland. His wife, Kenyatta, and son Samari have accompanied him here today. I think it's only right that this is a family affair. He grew up some 3 miles away from here. Some might say a world away, in a West Baltimore row house off Tioga Parkway. Now, he is the author of a lot of things. The 2008 memoir, The Beautiful Struggle, A Father, Two Sons, and an Unlikely Road to Manhood, was his first book, and it's excellent. You should read it. But prior to his current post, he served as the Martin Luther King Visiting Associate Professor at MIT, and he's currently the journalist in residence at the City University of New York, a post he assumed this past fall. Now, most of us here know him from his work as a senior editor at The Atlantic. Now, I'm just going to say, I've been on faculty here for 7 years, and I've taught Ta-Nehisi Coates' work in my classrooms for the last 7 years. I cite him repeatedly in my own published work, and rather than run down the full catalog, which would literally take up much of our time, I'll only give you some of his greatest hits, and ones I've found particularly rewarding. May 2008, This Is How We Lost to the White Man, The Audacity of Bill Cosby's Black Conservatism. September 2012, Fear of a Black President. That's my personal favorite, actually. 2012 was also the year that Mr. Coates won the Hillman Prize for Opinion and Analysis in Journalism. 2014, March, Black Pathology and the Closing of the Progressive Mind. Now, that particular ditty came as a response to a man in a different magazine making a different set of arguments, and it created a debate about culture and structure. I used the debate between Ta-Nehisi Coates and Jonathan Chait to actually frame how we think about policy and progress in the post-1970s period and beyond. And then May 21st, 2014, the case for reparations, which won Mr. Coates the 2014 George Polk Award for Commentary. Now, if you're here, you likely have already read that piece. But suffice it to say that the accomplishment of that particular piece of writing goes far and wide. It has changed my own relationship with colleagues who have read it, and were finally able to use words like white supremacy in public after reading that piece. I didn't really believe much in the power of persuasion, even though I am an academic and this is my line of work, until I saw the social impact of Ta-Nehisi Coates' writing. The great writer Walter Mosley called him, quote, the young James Joyce of the hip-hop generation, a generation to which both he and I belong. My little dark secret is actually write to hip-hop music. I don't know if you do the same. It's pretty good, actually. But I think it's important to note that among many of us, we actually give him a higher accolade in considering him the James Baldwin of our generation. Ta-Nehisi's next book will be Between the World and Me, Notes on the First 150 Years in America, published in October 2015. We will try to talk about history, causes, and consequences today, and I can think of no better person to get our conversation started than Mr. Ta-Nehisi Coates. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. It's a lot of people. I thought when they changed the time, I got a little worried. But I see my people are here. As Nathan said, my son is here. My wife is here. My two nephews are here. My dad is here. And perhaps most shockingly to me, my 3rd and 4th grade gifted and talented teacher is here, Miss Ronald. I can't believe it. The shock of the hour. Seriously. And see what you guys are doing right now is you're applauding because she's a teacher, but you actually don't know. how shall I characterize my experiences with education? Conflicted. It's probably a good euphemism that we will use at this moment. It was a rough path. And I think one of the things that I was always struggling with was trying to align my curiosity with the demands of school. And when I think about the times when that curiosity, which I always had, I read incessantly, wrote on my own time, did that sort of thing. When I think about the times when it aligned most closely, I think about my time in Ms. Roan's class. And I was like 8 or 9 years old, and I think I went, unfortunately through the rest of my time in public school here in Baltimore City, wondering why school was not like Ms. Roan's class. But that's all right, that's okay, because I'm back to it now. One of the things that was in that class was like, what I remember about it is like this constant sort of demand to, be curious and to make things. It was all about making things. And I stand before you right now as somebody who's been lucky enough to make a career out of making things. One of the things that I made about a year ago was, as Nathan mentioned, the story, The Case for Reparations, which I thought in many ways was incomplete. It was about housing and how wealth is built in this country and why certain people have wealth and certain other people do not have wealth, and the manifold implications of that and the roots of that through slavery, through Jim Crow, indeed through federal, state, and local policy. The buzzword in that piece was plunder. That if you want to understand the relationship between African Americans and the country that they inhabit, you must understand that one of the central features of that relationship is plunder, is the taking from black people in order to empower other people. Obviously, enslavement, which lasted in this country for 250 years, the period of enslavement in this country is much longer than the period of freedom for black people, is the ultimate plunder. It is nothing but plunder. It is a total plunder of your body, of your family, of your labor, of your everything, of your very essence. And that plunder enriched this country such that in 1860, at the time of Civil War, the enslaved black population in this country, 1/3 of which constituted the amount of people living in the South, was worth something on the order of $3 billion, was worth more than all the combined capacity, assets, all the banks, all the railroads, all the nascent factories and businesses in this country put together were worth less than the enslaved black people in this country. So plunder is not incidental to who we are. Plunder is not incidental to what America is. When you think about the period of Jim Crow and the stripping of black people's right to vote, this is not, the mere stripping of some sort of civic ceremony. It's a stripping of your ability to have any sort of say in how your tax dollars are used. And it is this, constant stripping, this taking away of rights that allow us to enter into a situation that I talk about in the Case for Reparations, where within the 20th century, you have programs being passed by which white families can accumulate masses of wealth through housing. And the main group of people who are cut out of that are black people, and that's federal policy. It's not just a matter of private, evil individuals. We get this picture of like white racists, these people walking around with horns, who, use the N-word all the time. And I guess look like Clive and Bundy. That's what we're looking for a bunch of Clive and Bundys. But Clive and Bundy has never really been the threat. It's the policy that's the threat. And many of those people are people who look like you and me, maybe not quite like me, but are like me, in terms that they're human beings. They're mothers and fathers, good people, nice to their neighbors. But these are people who are responsible for policies in our country that leave us where we are. Now, the reason why I said I felt that piece was incomplete is because there's a methodology, a tool that has been used to make sure that black people are available for plunder. And a major tool in making that process happen has been the criminal justice system. It's very, very important to understand. I saw the governor, I read the governor in the New York Times today, and he was saying in the paper that because there's going to be a big day tomorrow, he was saying, violence will not be tolerated. And I thought about that as a young man, who's from West Baltimore and grew up in West Baltimore, and I thought about how violence was tolerated for all of my life here in West Baltimore. I woke up in the morning, as I've told people, repeatedly, as I've gone around the country and talked about reparations. When I was going to middle school, I thought about every little article that I wore when I walked out the house. I thought about who I was walking with. I thought about how many of them there were. I thought about what neighborhoods they were from. I thought about which route I was going to take to school. Once I got to school, I thought about what I was going to do during the lunch hour. Was I actually going to have lunch, or was I going to go and sit in the library? When school was dismissed, I thought about what time I was going to leave school. I thought about whether I should stay after school for coach class. I thought about whether I should take the bus up to my grandmother's house, which way I should go home if I was going to go home. And every single one of those choices was about the avoidance of violence. It was about the protection of my body. And so I don't want to come off as though I'm sympathizing, or saying that it's necessarily okay to inflict violence, just out of anger, no matter how legitimate that anger is. But I have a problem when you begin the clock with violence on Tuesday. Because the fact of the matter is that the fact of the matter is the lives of black people in this city, the lives of black people in this country have been violent for a long time. Violence is how enslavement actually happened. People think of enslavement as like a summer camp where you just have to work, you know what I mean? And then you go and somebody gives you food, and lodging. But enslavement is violence. It is torture. Torture is how, it was made possible. You can't imagine enslavement without stripping away people's kids and putting them up for sale. And the way you did that was you threatened people with violence. Jim Crow was enforced through violence. That was the way, things got done. You didn't, politely ask somebody not to show up and vote. You stood in front of voting booths with guns. That's what you did. And the state backed this. It was state-backed violence. And violence, is not, even within our past. Violence continues today. I was reading a stat, and I haven't tracked this down, but I'm just going to go ahead and assume it's true because it's very likely to be true, that the neighborhood where the quote-unquote riots popped off earlier this week, in fact, the most incarcerated portion in the state of Maryland. And this is not surprising. This is not surprising. We live in a country where the incarceration rate is 750 per 100,000. Our nearest competitor is allegedly undemocratic Russia at 400 or 500 per 100,000, something like that. China has roughly 1 million more people than America has. America incarcerates 800,000 more people. And as bad as that national incarceration rate is, incarceration rate for black men is somewhere around 4,000 per 100,000. So if you think the incarceration rate for America is bad, for black men, it's like up here somewhere. It's just ridiculous. There's no real historical parallel. And incarceration is even in and of itself a kind of euphemism, a very, very nice word for what actually happens when they caught you off and take you to jail for long periods of time. Jails are violent. To survive, you use violence. To be incarcerated in this country is to be subjected to the possibility of sexual assault. It's to be subjected to the possibility of violence from fellow inmates, to be subjected to the possibility of violence from guards. And the saddest part about this is this mirrors the kind of violence that I saw in my neighborhood as a young man in West Baltimore. There's a phrase I've been thinking about a lot recently by the great Russian writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I hope I pronounced that right. This is being live streamed, so I'm gonna get all sorts of tweets if I said Solzhenitsyn wrong. Solzhenitsyn, you said it wrong. But Solzhenitsyn has this great quote that I think about all the time, and he says in his book, his 3 books, The Gulag Archipelago, wherever the law is, crime can be found. And I love this quote. I teach writing, and so that's a beautifully written quote. It's a beautifully written sentence because it hints at, though it does not say, the human agency in law and what we call people. And so certain things are violence, and certain things are not. Certain things are the acts committed by thugs, and certain things are the acts committed by the law. And in terms of rendering black people illegitimate, in terms of putting black people in certain boxes where things can be done to them, the vocabulary is very, very important, and the law is very, very important in terms of where we draw the line. My words, particularly here at Johns Hopkins, since I'm here at Johns Hopkins, and I'm not in West Baltimore, and I'm not out on North Avenue, and I'm not at Mondawmin Mall. My words for Johns Hopkins is that you are enrolled in this. You're a part of this. You're a great institution here in this city. And none of us, I know that, there are individuals here, I know President Johns Hopkins didn't ask for this. Nobody asked for it. Nobody asked to be part of it. But when you're an American, you're born into this. And there are young black people, who folks are going on TV and dismissing as thugs and all sorts of other words. I know the mayor apologized. I want to acknowledge that. But people are dismissing as thugs and criminals and lawless. These people live lives of incomprehensible violence. And when you decide, and I know this, this is not theory. I'm telling you, this is not theory here. This is not theory because, I'm telling you about what my daily routine was, but I went to school with some kids. I can't even imagine what the violence was like. It was just beyond anything. I had a safe home. I had people who loved me, and took care of me. I can't imagine how crazy it actually can get. And so when we label people those sorts of things, when we decide we're going to pay attention to them, when they pick up a rock, when we decide we're going to pay attention to them, and call them violent, when they act out in anger, well, we're making a statement. We're making a statement. And, again, being here in the seat of power, being here at Johns Hopkins, where I'm happy to be, thank you for hosting me. It's a very influential institution, though. You're a part of that. You're a part of that. I'm sure there are powerful people sitting here in the audience who can, talk to some folks and say, maybe we need to change our vocabulary a little bit. What are we doing to actually mitigate the amount of violence, that is in the daily lives of these young people? And let's not begin the conversation with the quote-unquote riot. Let's back up a little bit. Let's talk about the daily, everyday violence that folks live under. Okay, I don't want to take up too much time. I want to make sure that we have time to have this discussion. And I don't know if I'm supposed to come back down there or sit up here. Can I have a seat? Okay, all right, so we're going to go ahead and get talking here. Thank y'all.
Folks hear me? My mic on?
You just got to project.
I'll project.
Yeah, right?
I'll project. I can do that.
Yeah.
All right. I think it's on now. Okay.
All right.
So, in your writing about violence and the state, you actually wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago, maybe more like a month ago now, in response to the dropping of the report from the Department of Justice about Ferguson. There's been a lot of kind of conversations about this moment in Baltimore linked to Ferguson in earlier moments. Now, what's interesting about the Ferguson report is it actually connected profoundly to your earlier work on the case of reparations in terms of this question of plunder. And the report talks about the fees that are being harvested from working class people by excessive policing. And the piece also finds a way to talk about emails between officers that have certain kinds of racial language. And so you get a sense that there's a deeply embedded racism at the office level that's in contributing to these practices of plunder. Then comes Baltimore, however. And in Baltimore, unlike Ferguson, you don't have an all-white city council. You don't have all-white political leadership. You have a city with black leadership. So I'm going to ask you a very easy question. How do you account for Baltimore having an event that is so similar to Ferguson?
Well, fairly easily. I mean, it's like I was just saying up there, this is not a matter of individuals. Well-meaning good people perpetrate the ends of white supremacy all the time. And they don't do that because they're bad mothers and bad fathers. They don't do that because they come home and kick their cat or their dog. And they don't do it necessarily because they have blonde hair or blue eyes or anything like that. It's a systemic level sort of thing. You know what I mean? And until we can understand that, until we can actually get down into the nitty-gritty of it and start looking at the past, this situation doesn't emerge out of nothing. And it's not a matter of having people who just look like you, sort of do the right thing. It's just not enough. I mean, how do you change the actual composition of a neighborhood, which is what's required? Having people who look like you is a good first step in that. I mean, who, presumably, and not just look like you, people who are from, the group of the majority of people is a good first step. But the work of undoing decades of redlining, the work of undoing decades of Jim Crow policy, is not something that can be accomplished in the past, 20 or 30 years is the period of black leadership here in Baltimore. And beyond that, Baltimore is part of a country. Baltimore is not just subject to local law. Baltimore is also subject to state law. It's also subject to federal law. To make this very, very real, the one thing that the mayor's been complaining about, this police officer's Bill of Rights, this was state policy. It's state law. It's state law. So Baltimore is not, can't just secede, and then just totally govern itself. And I don't know that everything would be fixed immediately, if that were the case anyway. But you're talking about multiple layers and multiple interests that, for much of American history have perpetrated the aims of white supremacy. And unfortunately, even today, despite our best intentions, continue to do so.
Mm-hmm. I want to open the floor to Dr. Furr-Holden.
So you said, which I found really interesting, because I love the case for reparations. It was, in the words of my colleague, very persuasive for me as well. I think the link between history, culture, and the criminal justice system as an institution and the sort of great injustice that it has been specifically for black men is something that I'd like to explore a little bit in this conversation. So one of the things that I teach to my students, and many of them are here today from Cultural Factors in Public Health, is the first part of the course we talk about race. And people are always surprised when I tell them that the majority of crack cocaine users are actually white. There's this myth that crack is a black drug, when in fact, close to 70% of crack cocaine users are white. Approximately the same number of crack cocaine sellers and dealers are white, but the majority of people involved in the criminal justice and correction system for crack cocaine-related offenses are African American, not of color. There are disproportionate numbers of Hispanic, but specifically are African American. Right. And when I try to make the link for people between, the laws surrounding crack cocaine on their face are not racist. It's how those laws are actually being enforced and used as a tool to launch an assault on African American men is where racism comes in. Would you be willing to sort of expand a little bit on not just the laws themselves, but how those laws are actually used and how that creates the inequity for African Americans?
Well, sure. I mean, and again, just in this same sort of vibe of expanding our purview a little bit. People who talk about the mass incarceration, they point to the drug war. That's like a rallying cry. It's become this sort of bipartisan thing. In the drug war. I'm skeptical of that, but I'll leave it as it be. I do think, though, that the thing to recognize is that the quote-unquote drug war, which some people date from the 70s, 80s, whenever, is actually the third drug war during only the 20th century. Every time that drug war was racialized, or to be more specific, was racist. So what's happening right here, right now, is actually not new. In 1914 or so, we had our first drug regulation. And this is like really, really important. Just going back to that Solzhenitsyn quote, wherever the law is, crime can be found. Laws do not descend from the gods on golden tablets. Laws are created by people, who are influenced by the same sort of social forces that everybody, else is. It's, and this, just to diverge for a quick minute, I mean, it's very, very important when we analyze the police, right? Because there's this expectation that somehow the police will be nobler than the majority population, that the police somehow will be nobler than the people that pass policies and send them into our communities to deal with problems that we would not in other communities send police to deal with. I think that's really, really, really important. And so, the early turn of the century, when you really first get drug regulation, it focuses on cocaine. And it doesn't just, blandly, colorblindly focus on cocaine. It focuses on cocaine specifically as a drug that has the power to disrupt white supremacy. Folks should go back and read some of these primary documents. They're absolutely insane. I'm talking about congressional testimony where folks are talking about black people who take cocaine and can withstand direct shots from bullets. Black people who take cocaine, so y'all are laughing, but this is real. This is real, I'm not making this up. You know, black people who take cocaine and it improves their marksmanship. Black people who, you know, take cocaine and suddenly, because, you know, we weren't there, you know, before, you know, can't, you know, withhold their lust for white women. This was real. This was our first drug war. This was our first drug war. And we had another one in the 1950s or so where, and I don't know if people are aware, we once had mandatory penalties for drug possession in the 1950s in this country, mandatory 2 years, just for drug possession. And this was racialized too. I mean, we had the same sort of hearings. Again, not only were they racialized or racist, they were politicized. Because what a lot of the Southern senators would try to say, that the drug problem was in fact a Northern problem. It was a problem almost exclusive to Northern Negroes, and this was used as a defense of Jim Crow, of racism in the South. I don't know if you can tell, but I'm nodding towards what I'm actually working on right now. That's why I got all these facts in my head I've been reading about. It's kind of spilling out. I'm sorry, guys. But anyway, that was the second time, and it was politicized. It was politicized. And if you look at the third time with crack cocaine, the same sort of thing was happening. One of the most depressing things is you can actually read like testimony from sitting congressmen when we get this 100-to-1 disparity. And they'll say, you know, I think this is a bad idea. I think we're kind of making policy, you know, out of just out of thin air. We're kind of in a panic right now. And then they would go vote for the policy. Like they would say this is crazy and then vote for it. They didn't want to get voted out of office, right? And so at every step, you know, this has been racialized, it's been politicized, it's been racist. If you understand that this is the country's history, and I'm just talking about like the drug war, right? Let's just bracket that off, you know. But if you can consider the entire heritage of white supremacy in this country, you can consider that you are living in a country that was quite literally founded on white supremacy. If you're living in a country that could not exist without notions of white supremacy. And that is the lion's share of this country's history. If you're being conservative, maybe you say that ends in the 1960s. I would not, but if you want to be conservative about it, you can say that ends in the 1960s, well within the lifetime of people who are in this room, well within the lifetime of people who are passing policies, well within the lifetime of our Congress. By what logic would our current drug war not be racist? By what, if somebody told you that, you knew that was somebody's past, their history, and they said, no, I didn't, you know, that has nothing to do with what I'm doing now. I have no idea how all these black men ended up in jail. I don't know what happened here. Yeah. I mean, would you believe that? Would you believe that? I mean, to a large degree, our understanding of, you know, politics and history and the criminal justice system in this country requires an incredible suspension of just basic logic that we use in our daily lives.
So you wrote in October of 2014, I've always said that, to be perfectly blunt, there's nothing wrong with black people that a complete and total elimination of white supremacy would not fix.
Yes, I believe that.
And that's what I believe. And I want black folk to read the case for reparations to know you're okay.
You're okay.
That the conditions within the community are not okay, but as a human being,
you're okay.
You're okay.
That's right. Whenever we have you know, something like this happen, as what happened in Baltimore, there is always, you know, it's become predictable. Yes, but where are the fathers? Yes, but what about, you know, out of wedlock birth? Yes, but what about the culture? I'm for fathers, by the way. You know, I think fathers are a good idea. I had a father. I'm a father. I endorse fathers, not against fathers. You know. But you know, you have to ask yourself, are people being honest about, you know, the conversation? And the kind of, you know, critiques, again, that we have, where we automatically, you know, default to this cultural, you know, critique of black people are very, 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 very old. And really, really go back to slavery. And, you know, unfortunately work really, really hard to legitimize the facts of oppression in this country. I think like it's really important to clarify something about culture. It's not so much that I'm a disbeliever in culture. It's not so much that I'm a disbeliever that if you live under a certain condition for a long, you know, period of time, that you develop, you know, certain habits. You know, in fact, I actually very much believe in that. That's what I was sort of trying to outline when I talked about my basic habits, you know, in Baltimore. And, you know, I've lived long enough and gone enough places to understand that sometimes you can develop those habits and they not be appropriate in other places. That's true, but see, that's true of anybody. That's true, you know, I like going over, my current love right now is the French language. And when I go over to France, I have very American habits that I have to check, right? And I have to recognize that I'm in a different world. So there's nothing particular about, young black people, on the street in a city like Baltimore developing habits, right? To survive, by the way, to survive. Habits that are necessary, habits that if you did not have, you might be likely to be killed. And then going somewhere else and finding out that those habits are not necessarily the best. That's a process that anybody goes through. If you reverse it and flipped it the other way, if you went from Johns Hopkins here and went over to North Avenue, on the west side of Baltimore, you might have to develop some habits to get through your life that you don't have. There's nothing normal about that, nothing pathological, nothing wrong about that at all. And it is in no way a mitigating factor. It is in no way, any sort of variable in talking about the effects of white supremacy in this country. I don't, believe that at all. We have, and you guys know this because you guys do the research, we have reams of historical, sociological, economic data on white supremacy. The effects, the history, the everything is well documented. I mean, I appreciate the praise about the case for reparations, but I'm often stunned because the work that it pulled from was not obscure. Some of this work was like Pulitzer Prize winning work. I mean, stuff from the Oxford History of the United States. It's your history right there at your library. It's not hidden off somewhere. And so I say that to say that I lost myself in my comment.
That's all right. That's all right. That's all right. That happens sometimes. It doesn't even matter. It doesn't even matter. We're okay. There was no question. There was no question.
That we're okay.
Yeah, that's right. There was no question.
The point I'm trying to say, I figured it out.
You got it? Okay, go ahead.
Okay, here it is. Here it is.
Go ahead, brother.
Listen, we have reams and reams of data on white supremacy, right?
Right.
The data for, showing the effects of culture is considerably thinner, being charitable, I'll say. And so if you had to choose between the two, you had to say, well, what is exerting the greatest weight here? If you were, fairly observant, I don't think there'd be much of a question about it.
Right. So if I can just ask the audience to do me one big favor, I would actually love this. If everybody can just say together on 3, white supremacy, I would really love that. Just to make it real, just to admit that it's out there. On 3, 1, 2, 3, white supremacy. Lord have mercy. Okay.
This is. I was sitting here watching to see who was squirming in their chairs. Because I know about 80 of you are in one of my courses, and we had a dialogue about a month ago around white privilege.
Right.
And I could tell you it was like shoving an elephant down some of their throats.
Why do people squirm?
People squirm, I think, because the notion for some people, I think, is just so foreign. Right. You are swimming in white privilege, and then some African-American professor says it to you, which is like taking you out of the water. And I do want to applaud specifically my cohort of students, because I will say the way you eat an elephant is one bite at a time. And I am wholly committed that these students not leave here the same way that they came. Right. And I don't know, I don't know what it's like to be white in America. I don't know what it's like to have grown up in an affluent neighborhood. I was the first person in my family to graduate from college. I did grow up in a loving, supportive home environment. But I grew up in a poor black community right outside of D.C. in Sea Pleasant, Maryland. We talked about that. So I can only imagine, like you say, some of these things. These are not obscure readings. These are not things that are in some, back alley library and, off the beaten path. But some of these notions for people are just really hard to swallow because it bumps up against their reality. They see themselves as good people. I had a student.
They are good people.
They are. We are good people. They're like, so if I'm the beneficiary of white supremacy, that is a threat to my good personness.
No, not at all. Right. Not at all.
So I would be curious to hear what you would have to say to folks who are, even right now, sitting in their chair, sort of grappling with this notion, trying to eat this elephant one bite at a time, because I'm convinced it will be, I said this to one of my students yesterday, a lot of the work around civil rights was not, it included many people outside of the African American community. For things to stay bad, good people have to do nothing. So this is not just something for people who are directly affected, because it actually affects all of us. So what could you say to my, yeah.
Well, I mean,
to all my good people squirming in their chairs.
well, I think the first thing is to stop squirming. There's nothing to squirm about. I am an American, you know. Part of my, heritage, and this is how complicated it gets, is the stripping of other people's land, which I live on. I'm part of that. When we launch wars in other countries, no matter how much I disagree, my name is on that. I'm part of it. I pay my taxes like everybody. I contribute to it. I'm part of it. It's part of my heritage, and legacy too. I'm sure if we had, a really learned feminist scholar up here, to talk, they could, very, very quickly point out about, the heritage of men and people of certain gender, and what they inherit in a certain way. Somebody from the LGBT community might point out that those of us, who are heterosexual inherit some other things. And that's okay. That's okay. I still sleep all right at night. And I don't sleep all right at night because, I think that, the sort of injustices that, are incurred on other people are okay. I sleep okay at night because I have to understand, what my place is in the struggle. People have to get this. We are talking about a centuries-long struggle. I think the way history is written, we have a tendency to pay attention to those people who bear witness to the greatest points and the sort of the highlights or the lowlights, of the struggle. And so Frederick Douglass is in part, obviously a great man, but in part important because he is around the seedy end of slavery. Martin Luther King, another great man, but obviously very, very, very important, in part because he's around to see the fall of segregation and the fall of Jim Crow. But I think what people miss in that analysis is all the individual people who struggle during their lifetimes and see nothing. And see nothing. 250 years of enslavement in this country. What that means is every year, some black person in some slave state woke up, committed some act of resistance, yelled out, in some sort of way, declared that it was wrong, and did not see the institution end in their lifetime. And not only did they not see the institution end in their lifetime, in all likelihood, they didn't see it end in their children's lifetimes or their grandchildren's lifetime. Slavery was the long night. It just was. And that was what you lived in. And that didn't stop people from struggling. People struggled anyway. And so I think in large respect, part of this is the expectation of change right now. What can I do right now? What can I do right now? Well, there's a lot you can do right now, but there's very little that you can do right now that will undo this long, long history. Your goal is, your job is to do your part right now. I say this all the time, but one of my great heroes, Ida B. Wells, her great goal, was to get, in large part, to agitate for some sort of anti-lynching legislation in Congress. Not only did it not happen in our lifetime, it never happened. Never. They didn't apologize till like 2004. Whenever they finally apologized the Senate apologized for not passing anti-lynching legislation, Ida B. Wells was long dead. Long dead. She got to see no change in her lifetime. So the first thing is I think we have to adopt a less self-centered notion of struggle. And I think that the second part of that is you have to ask yourself how you want to live as a thinking person in this world, as all people are in this world. Being white in this country, believing yourself to be white in this country, thinking yourself to be white in this country, as Baldwin would say, affords you the luxury of retreating into a dream. It affords you the luxury of believing that the suburbs sprung up because people just walked out and planted stakes there. It affords you the luxury of looking at Pennsylvania and North Avenue, looking at what happened in Mondawmin Mall and saying that's violence while ignoring your president, sending drones to other places, bombing, no matter how unintentionally, bombing wedding parties and saying, but that's okay, that's all right. You can live like that. It really does. And increasingly for some black people, we also had that luxury. But is that enough? Is that enough? History and politics do not exist to make you feel good about yourself. If you need to feel good about yourself, hug your mama. If you need to feel good about yourself, hug your kids. Go volunteer at a homeless shelter. And I'm not denigrating any of that. All of those are good things that should be done. But you don't get into this work of writing. You don't get into any sort of serious work of politics to feel good about yourself. That's just not what's supposed to happen here. So if white people in your class are feeling bad, hey, welcome to the world.
Yeah.
We feel bad about it too. We feel bad about it too.
So, one of my favorite scholars, a man by the name of Michel Rolfe-Trouillot, an anthropologist, wrote a book called Silencing the Past. And my graduate students know it because I assign it every year, but I'm not assigning your stuff. And he has a line from that book where he says that we are not ever as embedded in history as when we pretend not to be. One of the most powerful things about your work is that you really are an evangelist for thinking historically. Steady diet of primary documents is a good thing, generally. You make a real argument for that. And one of the things that I think is so powerful is that you talk about slavery, but you also talk about housing. And most people tend to separate those discussions. We have a discussion about reparations on the one hand, and we have a discussion about segregation in schools on the other. But you actually show a continuity that shows that if slavery was the backbone of antebellum in 19th century America, that housing segregation is the backbone of the economy in the 20th and now the 21st century. And it's very important to think about where we all live in the context of that history. It actually forces us to grapple with it. And so I'm curious to know, number one, how you came to think about economics and housing as being at the foundation of these issues, if it was more biographical, given your experience, or something you came to through the text, or a combination of both. But then also, I think, to link it to some of the work that Debra does about kind of health and the weathering of black people in particular kinds of neighborhoods, to quote Tom Levis as well, one of our colleagues. How do you understand the kind of day-to-day violence, again, to use that language, that people are experiencing because of the way that the housing is organized in this country?
Well, I mean, just growing up here, you know that white people live somewhere and you live somewhere else.
Speak up! Thank you.
Sorry about that.
Did the mic die?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, guys.
There we go.
Well, I mean, just living here in Baltimore, I mean, or living anywhere in America, you immediately understand that white people live one place and you generally live somewhere else. And you don't think that where white people live, everything is okay, but you know that somehow it's a little different. And so in that sense, that's just a sort of biographical, observation. And, in general, they got a little more than you. But, to speak about that, I think we just sort of get in the habit of observing that. And it's very easy to think that that's just the way things are. That this is just sort of personal preference. White people like being around white people and black people like being around black people, and that's just the way it is, period. And by the way, this is like in our language. We want to heal racial division, heal, racial discord. And implicit in that idea is that the divide is not somehow man-made. The divide is somehow natural, and we, through education, through all our good works, will somehow bridge that divide. But in fact, we made the divide. And one of the large ways we made the divide was through housing. The book that really turned my head on this was Kenneth Jackson's Crabgrass Frontier, which is actually a history of the suburbs. I thought I was just reading a history of the suburbs. I didn't come to read about black people. I was like, black people in the suburbs, so I'm just going to read about white people now. But what Jackson shows is, in fact, there is no, the suburbs is directly tied to the housing discrimination that was practiced against black people. And to make this as explicit as I possibly can, to write about this, I've alluded to this, all through the talk. The fact of the matter is that in the 1930s and the 1940s, we made a decision in this country that we wanted to have a broad middle class. And we wanted to, give more people wealth building opportunities. And the way we did that was through subsidizing housing, federal government. This was not, I know people think that, well, my dad just, went off the war, came back, worked really hard, and then we had a house, and, you need to do the same thing, too. I saw Bill O'Reilly. He was on with Jon Stewart, and Jon Stewart was interviewing him about how O'Reilly grew up in Levittown. Anybody knows anything about Levittown? Levittown existed, just wholly on segregation. That's what it was. And the people who lived in Levittown had access to loans that were by, American policy denied to black people. And O'Reilly is, talking about how all these people did X, Y, and Z and how, hard they worked. Well, we worked hard too.
It's not that your dad didn't work hard, it's not your mom didn't work hard, but my mom and dad worked hard too, you know? I mean, I think that's the big difference. And so we made a decision to reward that hard work in a certain kind of way. And what we did was we went to the banks in this country, and we said, hey, you know, well, such and such at this moment can't afford a mortgage because your down payment, you know, has to be, is pretty ridiculous. You need somewhere around 30, 50% down, and who can afford that? Here's the deal, we'll subsidize the loans. No matter whether, you know, John Doe defaults on the loan or not, we'll pay for it. We have your back. And that allowed the banks to drop the down payment. That gives birth to the whole 30-year mortgage program that we have today. And suddenly, this mass of Americans had access to home building, to home owning opportunity. Now, this is to say nothing about all the sort of deprivation of wealth that was happening before. This is just, again, focusing on one measly sector. You know, one really important sector, but there are other sectors too, so you have to understand that even as I'm focusing on this, there are other aspects of plunder happening at the same time. But just focusing on housing, the only people that were denied that opportunity, or a major group of people that were denied that opportunity, was black people. And at the very same moment, the federal government, through the FHA, the HOLC, under New Deal policy, no less, by the way, under New Deal policy, this is not, you know, some, you know, evil Republican, you know, say this is FDR, this is who we're talking about, this is Truman, this is who we just be very clear, this is who we're talking about here. At the very same moment that this was happening, we were sending folks out into every major city, including Baltimore, especially Baltimore, and we were having people produce these maps of these cities. And we were delineating down to the very block level who lived where and what their race was, what they checked on the census form. And if there was one African-American family on that block, it automatically ruled it out for receiving these subsidized homes. It was, as we call it today, red line, because the maps literally were made red. If you want to understand at least one source of the wealth chasm that exists in this country, for every dollar of wealth that black families have, white families have something on the order of 20. And that doesn't even really completely like get at it. You know, some of our great sociologists are now doing this work on neighborhood poverty. And so an African-American family that makes around $100,000 a year tends to live in the kind of neighborhood that a white family that makes $30,000 lives in. These are large, huge vectors of spatial inequality. Just incredible. And inequality makes it passive. Let's call it what it is, plunder. Because that's what it is, plunder through policy, violence. And so black people live in these neighborhoods that, you know, historically have been plundered over and over again, and a variety of effects take place. And if you're me, if you're a young kid, you know, in the 1980s, the shadow of the civil rights movement, you know, after all these years of housing, you know, segregation and Jim Crow policy, well, yeah, your neighborhood tends to be a little more violent than other people's neighborhoods, just a little bit. And I didn't even endure the worst of it. The hardest thing, again, I'll go, you know, just going back to this about the case for reparations is, as far as I'm concerned, it's not mysterious. You know, you don't need a Ph.D. with all, you know, due respect to our folks up here to figure this out. I dropped out of college, man. You know what I mean? I dropped out. Anybody can get to it. It's in the books. As Chuck D used to say, check out the books they own. It's right over there in your library if you want to know. It's not magic.
So in the interest of time, we want to open it up to questions and really brief comments. Preferably questions, right? Because we are thinking about plans of action. So we'll have Janice on this aisle, and Jacqueline on that aisle. And there are obviously a lot of people in this room. There are a lot of ideas that people want to be able to share and to probe. And so I would ask you to please be as concise as you can. Do try to have a question that we can digest and that all of the panelists can, in fact, respond to, or at least more than just Mr. Coates if you're so inclined. Give a second for the room to kind of shake out. Okay. Step close to the mic when you use it, please. Yes.
Thank you so much. I wanted to thank you for talking about enslavement, because I feel that it's really difficult. I talk about it and people seem to think it is 1,000,000 years ago, and yet it's 100-some. I did Ancestry.com to track my ancestry, and it takes maybe, you know, a couple generations for me to find how I'm linked to slaveholder records. So, or how my ancestors are linked to slaveholder records. And I think people don't realize that. So it's important to keep that going. That was my comment. My quick question is, why are you skeptical of the drug war? I don't see how mass incarceration happens without the way drug policy is happening in this country. So I'd love to hear more about that.
That's a great question. That's a great question. Obviously, I would like the drug war to end, but I think activists, when we focus on that, we miss something. The drug war is important. The drug war is important because it controls the churn of African Americans into the prison system. And so a huge number of folks who are actually going to go through the prison system are actually going to be African American. And once you go through the prison system, all these manifold effects take place. Perhaps most importantly, your ability to get a job is immediately impacted. So in that respect, it's important. It's very important, though, to open up the conversation. I don't think if we end the drug war, this problem goes away. I think we got to talk about violent crime, or what we call violent crime. I think we hit people too hard for violent crime. I know that's not a popular thing to say. I know the bipartisan activists don't go out and say that, but I actually think, like, if you compare what we do for people who are, let's take the worst one, for murder, what we do for people who are convicted in murder, there really is no precedent. When you talk about mass incarceration, I want to make sure that we're talking about solitary confinement. You know what I mean? And I don't want to leave that out. I'm very, I understand why activists do certain things. I understand the Rosa Parks strategy, where you get the most respectable, the most innocent, looking victim, and you make that, person the post. I understand that. But as a writer, as a thinker, my job is to sort of push the boundaries, and say not even just the person who you think of as being the most respectable and the most innocent should be part of this conversation. The fact of the matter is, I think it's something like 40% state prison population, are people who were locked up for violent crimes. I don't think they should be excluded from the conversation. I don't say that to justify their incarceration. No, I say that to ask, well, how did they get there? How do you end up being, in a situation where you are convicted, of a violent crime? And so I think just focusing on the drug war is not quite enough. The last thing I think people need to understand is, regrettably, mass incarceration for African Americans is quite old. It didn't begin in 1970. I know that's like the thrust. That suddenly, we did this, turn, under Nixon, in 1970. And we kind of did, in terms of the sheer scale of it. It's new in terms of the sheer numbers. But in terms of the ratio, there's and I'm blanking on names. I'm sorry, forgive me. I'm going to have all this very, very soon, though. But there's a great sociologist who's done this work, and he's shown that as early as 1910, in the northern cities, the incarceration rate for black people was roughly 800 to 100,000. It's a direct response to the Great Migration. Mm-hmm. The gap, the actual ratio, the black to white ratio in terms of incarceration in this country, even though the scale has changed, the ratio has not changed much at all. It's actually about what it was during the time of Jim Crow. And so I think focusing on the drug war is a very, very easy thing to do. This guy who was just, standing on the corner smoking a joint and got arrested. Well, yeah, I'm against that too. But I don't want to leave the conversation right there. I think it's really, really important to broaden it out and to, just talk about this in the best way, in the biggest way possible.
Yes.
Good morning, good afternoon. Can't keep track of the time. The first thing I want to do is commend the Hopkins students who marched with the students yesterday downtown. I worked at Hopkins in the 80s and the 90s in the School of Public Health, and I worked with the residents who lived north of Hopkins who were basically pushed out of the neighborhood as it became gentrified. And my question, and thank you, Mr. Coates, for the incredible writing that you're doing, because so many of us read it and carry it, post it and so on. But so I worked with the residents north of Hopkins who were very strong in fighting for equity for themselves and their families. And now I'm seeing Hopkins contributing to the gentrification of Station North in a very big way. So my question to you is if Hopkins called you in to advise them on how they should change their policies in Baltimore City, what recommendations would you give them?
Well, I probably would decline, and then I would give them I wouldn't, decline out of any sort of modesty or anything like that. But, I'm a writer. I'm actually not the expert. I am pulling from people who, basically devote their lives to these singular issues in terms of housing and in terms of how black people. I have a list of, experts who I consult, who I would immediately, refer them to. So that's probably what I would do. I have to stay in my lane and play my position.
Can I say something about that? Because it's a really important point that you make.
Expert.
This notion of staying in your lane, right? Mm-hmm. I spoke to our School of Public Health on this issue yesterday, and one of the things that I found is we have a really compassionate, committed, happy, feel-good cohort of students, staff, and faculty at the university who will often rush in to participate in things in ways that I think are actually inconsistent with the biggest difference that we as an anchor institution and as a leading academic institution should actually be contributing to some of these topics. So I would be curious if you have some thoughts or some offerings for our community around, there is a role for the intellectual in what's happening in America. There is a role for the researcher, for the person who's working in a laboratory, trying to understand, for example, the sort of biochemical processes that are happening to African Americans in communities where they're under constant assault. So they have this damage that's happening under the skin. You talk about violence. Violence is so insidious, it doesn't just directly impact you when somebody physically assaults you, but there's something happening under the skin when you're under constant siege and having to manage, which way do I go? Oh, I'm 10 minutes late, now the guys are out on the, there's a whole world of it that's coming. And I think one of the big things that we grapple with and oftentimes will move too fast and in a manner that's not effective is we get out of our lane. Yeah. So I don't have a problem with people going and volunteering and doing the cleanup, but is that really the biggest contribution that this institution
what is
can
the
make?
Biggest contribution that this institution can make, you think?
I think there's many. I think we have something really to offer both intellectually and from a policy perspective. Mm-hmm. We have a policy institute here. We have researchers, I'm one of them, who are doing the kind of work that really should be driving then the policies that are being created. Right. We have an opportunity to undo with some of our programming some of the divide. We do have a program, the Baltimore Scholars Program. So any Baltimore City Public, yep. We have the Baltimore Scholars Program, so any Baltimore City Public School graduate that is accepted to Hopkins gets full tuition. I mean, there are things that we can do. We wield a fair amount of political power. Right. For the first time ever, I actually worked in partnership with our governmental affairs office to really chime in on some things that were happening in Annapolis. Right. I think we need to be doing more of that. I kind of wanted to, this is my own thing, kind of to throw this out here. What is in our wheelhouse? Right? And really, who are we in the matter of this stuff, and what is the biggest difference we can make? So I've thrown some things out, but I want them to stay in that inquiry also and be generating and looking for that for themselves, as well as our president, who is doing that.
I think the other thing that is on the table, or that should be on the table for thinking about, is taxes. Because we obviously play a very important role in employing a lot of people in this city. But a lot of the families that are affiliated with Hopkins, that are employed by Hopkins, that are simply living outside of Hopkins, are forced to pay the burden that the state's largest employers do not pay. And we have to think about that as being a causal factor in the violence that we saw this past week.
I'm sorry, can you explain that just a little bit?
Sure. In other words, if you have a community chest where people are starved for the resources to keep open community centers, starved for the resources to keep schools running with effective curriculum material, computers, other kinds of information that they might need for better food, better housing options, increasing the regulatory state around civil rights or housing justice. If you don't have the dollars to actively create an active, robust enforcement apparatus for the government to then protect people, then enforcement slips.
But specifically about the taxes, like you were saying,
well,
like who are employed here, you said there's a different sort of status?
Well, no, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying across the country, right, universities do not have to pay taxes.
Oh, I understand. I got you.
And that creates some problems. And so I think as a thought leader, we can maybe think about that a little bit.
Right, I got you.
That's all I'm saying.
Thank you for your time. I'm really glad that this is the direction the questions went in, because when you mentioned Ida B. Wells, it was interesting. In my archives last week, I found the president of Fisk talking to his news editor saying, okay, let's just put this one newspaper article out so that if the Dyer bill actually passes, we'll look like we did something, but it actually absolves us from, critique. And it raises to me the question of optics. And I'm glad that we've convened this panel. And my question really is, what's next? Because as you mentioned, Hopkins is really instrumental in the community, but it's also, destroying neighborhoods to expand and setting up very concrete walls, even if they're built or imagined, between the community and Hopkins. And for the lives of the Black and brown students here at Hopkins who are increasingly marginalized. I've been here for 4 years as a graduate student. And I still walk Gilman Hall and get asked if I'm lost. And so there's very real things that are happening both within the institution and the institution's relationship to the community that this is really nice. But what's next? And as Nathan said, we don't want to domesticate this discussion. And I think it would be wise, while we're in here in this moment, to not run away from the fact that Hopkins is promoting and engaged in very institutionally destroying, destructive, and racial policies as well that needs to be addressed.
I have to speak to this. So I was an undergraduate here. I came here in 1992 from Seat Pleasant in my 1985 Ford Escort. I participated in what was called the Pew program. And it was a program for minority students, sort of a running start summer pre-program where we got to take a few classes, earn a few credits, and get acclimated to campus. There were 18 students in my cohort, and there were less than 80 Black students on campus when I was a freshman here. We worked very hard. It was a young man by the name of Kobe Jallo Little. And he was perhaps, I don't know if there's any old school professors around here who remember Kobe Little, but he was somebody like no other. And when I tell you, I really encourage the students here to really understand the history and where we've been, because my senior year, we more than doubled the number of Black students on campus in one inaugural, highly Black freshman class. So while we have a ways to go, I really want to put it in perspective so you can see how far we've come. What was the mechanics and the mechanisms behind that progress? Because there is something here that's gotten really stagnant. I would say the difference in what I've seen between the cohort of students that are here now and my cohort, we kept our foot on the necks of the administration. Our foot stayed on their necks. And we have Baltimore scholars. I see, this is to me like a sea of color. This is night and day above and beyond where we were back in the 90s. And there's still work to be done, but it's important to understand the history and have it in a context so you can actually be effective at doing that work.
Let's get another question.
Hi, Mr. Coates. Thank you so much for coming. Also, shout out William H. Lamell Middle School.
A little louder. You went to Lamell?
Yes, I graduated from William H. Lamell in 1987.
Okay, all right.
But my question for you is about...
I might have been there. You said 87 you went?
97.
97, oh, I wasn't there.
There's a lot of talk about body cameras for police for issues of accountability.
You said body cameras.
Body cameras.
Okay.
But there's already so many videos of Black people being killed on YouTube that are circulating on social media. So I want to know your thoughts on if you think those images are helpful in raising awareness, or do you think they're kind of perpetuating this desensitization of Black death and destruction in our communities? Thank you.
This is actually an interesting question. People ask this. I don't know that they desensitize. I think we're pretty desensitized to it. Eric Garner was choked to death on camera. We see how that ended. I think body cameras are cool. I mean, it's a good step. It's like the drug war. I mean, it's a thing that should be, part of the equation. But again, as a writer, just to push this conversation, forward, I think the whole rubric or idea of police reform is sort of mistaken.
because it presumes that the society that creates the police, the society that directs the police is actually really, really well-intentioned, and if we only train the police different, everything will be okay. But you can see like a myriad of these cases where in other communities we don't even use the police. It was the young man down in Atlanta, who, I mean, this is just the most tragic, story you want to hear. He was having some sort of a mental health issue. He had stopped taking his medication, stripped off, butt naked, was jumping off of the balcony. Somebody calls the police. They shoot him dead. They shoot him dead. One of his last tweets was about, all the stuff going on down in Ferguson, and what he said was, I don't, know why we need to blame, 90% of cops for something that, a really small minority of cops are doing. Good American. And I'm not trying to impugn him in any sort of way. And I'm saying it didn't save him, right? And I'm saying in another community, maybe we would have dealt with that a little bit differently. The gentleman, and I'm sorry there's been so many, I'm just losing now. I'm just losing it now. But there was a gentleman, in Wisconsin, having some sort of episode, with mushrooms, drug problem. He ends up dead. And this is like over and over and over again. Tamir Rice, right? I mean, this is really, somebody else might look at that and think about that as an issue in terms of rec centers, as an issue in terms of opportunities, as an issue in terms of architecture, neighborhood. There are all sorts of other ways of dealing with that before you get to the point where the cop is basically pulling a drive-by on a 12-year-old child. But you can't begin the conversation there. You can't say that cop now that cop did need to be better trained, by the way. I mean, he had been fired from some other department. So training is part of it, right? But you really got to, sort of back up. Because, in fact, this is the way white supremacy works. White supremacy does not start at the point the cop pulls out the gun. It's working like 5 steps back in all sorts of dimensions. And so if you're going to think about solutions, that's kind of the way you have to think about it. And so body cameras are cool. I mean, that's okay. You know what I mean? I'm not against body cameras. I think that's a good first step. But if we're going to strap body cameras on cops and then say, okay, we reform now, listen, man. The criminal justice system in this country... I mean, the fact that the criminal justice system in this country is the oldest and most used tool of enforcing white supremacy. This is just true. This is true. It's always been true. And, you can't, boil this down to a conversation about good and bad cops. Cops are people just like I said, plenty of good people who are police officers. See, my question is, why are they there? You still don't know what Freddie Gray actually did. I mean, think about that. You actually don't know what he did. I mean, we're talking about, once he got in the wagon, they didn't follow certain policies. Why was he in the wagon? Why was he in the wagon? I mean, that's like the level we need to be to. What was he doing? And from what I've seen, what the police report says, he made eye contact with the officer and ran. This is a crime now. This is a crime. This is subject. So forget whether Freddie Gray dies or not. That means that's something that they are doing to people regularly in West Baltimore. They're looking at black men, and if you look at them the wrong way, I mean, who knows what Freddie Gray might have realized he was late for an appointment or something. But that's the kind of, charity that you can't really extend to people because they live in a certain neighborhood, whereas you would extend that to other people. And see, that's the sort of level that we really have to, there's drug policy behind that. There's policy behind that. And so I'm deeply skeptical of this sort of, focus on the police, that if you just reform the police, everything will be okay. Listen, we're about to have an election. Hillary Clinton gave this, speech up at Columbia. She wants to talk about criminal justice. I'm all for that, right? And she's going to deploy her husband, out on the trail, definitely. He's going to be out there, right? Under no circumstance should he appear anywhere and people not ask him about the 94 crime bill. Under no circumstances.
That's right.
Under no circumstances. Forget the cops. Forget the cops. You got to talk about the policy. Chuck Schumer, who is about to be Senate minority leader. I'm losing my count where we are. Senate minority leader. People should go back and look at the quotes he gave when the 94 crime bill was passed. When he was, going around, talking about how Democrats had reclaimed the crime issue. People should examine the Vice President of the United States, who when he was pushing the crime bill said, quite frankly, my goal is to lock Willie Horton up. Now, Willie Horton was already locked up by that point, so he was talking about something else. Biden's vice president right now. He's vice president right now. And so this sort of focus on the individual police officers, I think is very, very convenient and misses the sort of broader issues that we have to talk about. Body cameras are fine, but you're going to need a lot more than that. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well stated.
Yes.
Thank you so much. I want to commend Mr. Coates for getting his article published at all, not in the back of the magazine, but on the front cover. That is so awesome. And it speaks to, when we thought, Dr. Furr-Holden talked about, eating the elephant a little bit at a time and how hard it was to convince her students that, there was a problem. I think that we as Americans and we in this university, and by the way, I'm very much an insider. I work for development and external affairs in the Bloomberg School. We are very, very committed to this narrative of progress. We're the city on the hill. We at the School of Public Health say we are saving lives millions at a time. We are the good people. And so my comment would be, it is so incredibly hard to rewrite history and help people to see that it has not always been this straight upward line of progress. And the historian Christopher Lasch wrote about the true and only heaven, progress and its critics. My question for you is, I've always struggled as a scholar of race and medicine with feeling like I'm preaching to the converted. And I think a lot of scholars who do this kind of work feel that way, that it's hard to get the message out to the people who need to hear it most. So when we leave this room today, what is your advice to us when we go out into our communities and conversations? How can we best explain to people who are not already convinced? Thank you.
Boy, that's a bad question to ask me. I am not sure how well, I think one thing needs to be brought into perspective. There are people in this country, and a not an insignificant portion of people, who have as their interest not understanding. And so ignorance is not always just, nobody told me. No, I also don't want anybody to tell me. Like that's part of the equation. And so as a writer, it's so hard because I'm caught in a paradox, right? I hope some people read The Case for Reparations and were, convinced and changed some minds. But I have to tell you, that was not my goal. That was not how I thought about writing that case. I, am very, very lucky. I grew up in a household with a dad who was, constantly, debate was part of the household. Just constant going back and forth about ideas. I went to Howard University where they were just so big, on making you face all of the, worst and most difficult questions about yourself. I'll never forget, I had a Central Africa class, just brief diversion. At the end of this class, the professor, had gone through the history. She said to us, okay, so now explain to me how it is that you cannot believe that black people are inferior to white people. It's a black professor. And you got to face that, like, head on. And so what that did was it kind of put something in my head when, my greatest debate partner is always right here. It's always right here. And that's always what I'm sort of at war with, because if it's not housing, if it turns out to be something else, then I have to say that. You know what I mean? If it turns out, enslavement actually had no impact, I have to say that. If it turned out it was a pretty minor, part of the economy, I have to say that. It's, this question about the drug war. It would be so easy to talk about mass incarceration as just the locking up of a bunch of nonviolent, black people who are just caught on the corner smoking joints. But no, you got to see the whole reality. You got to see the whole reality, and then you have to make your argument from there. And so that to me, this sort of constant quest to try to see, the world as it is, as best I can, in the moment as I can. That's really, where I write from, and that's really the place that, I come from in terms of my investigation. And then after that, once I have that, I try to write with as much force as I can. I don't try to make people comfortable. I don't try to make people feel good about themselves. I don't try to make people feel good about their country. There are enough people out there making people feel good about themselves, making people feel good about their country. It's not very hard to do that if you want to. That's not my job as a writer. My job is to write, as I said, the truth as I see it and write it as forcefully as I possibly can. And that makes me happy. Yeah. That makes me very, very happy. And if it grabs some other people, you know what I mean? I think that's excellent too. But the writing is mine. The writing is mine. The writing is with my pleasure. The writing belongs to me, and I will not bend it. I will not, compromise it in such a way, to adjust to people's sensitivities. I have to do that in my life enough as it is. Just walking as a black person through the society. I just won't do it in the writing. And I think an intelligent person would want that. You know, I don't want you spoon feeding me. You know, I don't want you, talking to me like I'm an idiot. Give it to me straight. Give it to me straight. You know, and I think like that, you know, writing in that sort of way is very, very respectful of people's intelligence.
So we have about, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, ask a question. Too much applause.
So we have about 5 minutes, I want to say. So first of all, let me just say apologies for those who are trying to drastically revise their questions. And I know it's 4 minutes. So if you can ask a very concise question, we would appreciate it. What I'll do really quickly is take 1 and then 2 back to back, and then we can try to expedite this. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to thank Mr. Coates again for coming. And you guys have spoken a lot about the carceral state and criminal justice system. And I was wondering what you thought the extent to which prisons for profit have played a role in, having financial incentives to imprison people. What extent has that played a role, and can anything really be done to change that, and what would you do to change prisons for profit in this country?
Great. And then one here.
This is for everybody in the panel. Yes or no, do you agree it's easier to talk about race in America than it is to talk about colorism and pigmentocracy?
Colorism, and what's the last one?
Pigmentocracy.
Pigmentocracy, okay. You can respond.
Okay, so I'll take the first one and then move over here. I don't know that you can talk about. I don't know that those two things are separate from each other. The idea that racism is one thing and colorism is something else. I think, and pigmentocracy is something else. It originates in the idea that race is this sort of hard concept. That you're talking about, two arguably, truthfully, demonstrably distinct groups of people, and one group discriminating against the other group. But in fact, the whole creation of one group and another group is the act of racism in and of itself. You have to name a group white people. You have to name that. You have to name a black race. That is part of the actual racism. And so when people who are within, this already imaginary box of black race then draw other lines within that race against other people, they're actually just doing the same thing. Now, they might not have a weight of the state behind them. They might not have, the cops behind them. They might not have, incarceration behind them. They might not have all of these, sort of manifold forces behind them. But they're actually just doing the same thing. And so I don't know that the two, are separate from each other. And in terms of the question, in terms of private prisons and prisons for profit, I think it's much like the question about the drug war. I think it's important, but I think at the end of the day, like mass incarceration is not something that was foisted on the American people. It's something the American people voted for through their representatives lustily and repeatedly. The viewing of black people, as a particular class of people, who are more prone to criminality, it doesn't take much convincing in America to get people to see that. It's actually quite, you don't need prisons for profit to get people to already believe that. Now, the prisons for profit don't help. They don't help. But that is such a dyed-in-the-wool idea. I got this document, and I'll make this quick. And one of the slaveholders, John Hammond, is soliciting a report on runaway slaves, runaway black people, whatever you want to call it, in Canada. And he's trying to make the case for why slavery is bad and why black people should never run away. Chock through that document is criminality. They go to Canada and they become criminals. This is 150 years ago, man. This is 150 years ago. And you can see the line. I mean, the whole thing Ida B. Wells was fighting against was this idea of criminalizing black people as rapists. That's what she was, battling against. And so I think in large respects, the prison for profits thing doesn't help, but it's an add-on. The real battle is to get folks in this country, to get a critical mass of people in this country, and some of them black, by the way, and some of them black, to stop viewing black people as somehow naturally or even culturally predisposed to crime. That really is the battle. And that's why I got to change that whole vocabulary about how we talk about those young people.
My question is just, how can we harness all the social chatter we're hearing now on social media? I'm 53, but I have my kids, on my feed, and they're all feeling a little bit defeated, like history just repeats. And when we hear the doctor here talk about taking one bite of that elephant, and we have come from here to there, even in my lifetime, and harness the fact that they actually can have a voice, that they can make a change. And I'm all for the truce and the hard truths, because that's what sets us free. but then we get defeatists to a generation who may not have been activists before, but they feel rallied with what they see happening. It is horrifying, the videos we see. And so how do we harness that?
We'll take one here too, quickly.
Yeah, I just want to say, if you want to talk about plunder, Mr. Coates, you've come to the right place. This university's wealth was built on the backs and lives of hundreds of slaves that worked the Hopkins plantation. So I want to know how we should be facing that past as leaders in this Baltimore community before we try to engage.
Go ahead, dog.
I've been talking about this for so long. My head is about to explode. Kenyatta knows I'm very tired. I think, here at Johns Hopkins, Johns Hopkins is not unique, in this. You're a great historian up at MIT, and I'm so tired that I'm forgetting his name. Has this great book, Ebony and Ivy. Somebody's going to help me out here.
Craig Wilder.
Craig Wilder, thank you very much. And it's all about how the Ivy League schools were built in much the same way. And again, that doesn't make the Ivy League schools or Johns Hopkins uniquely evil. People have to understand what enslavement was to this country. It was not something practiced in a dark room, over here on the side. It was something people were proud of. When the Confederacy seceded, from the North, and I saw that, statue of Robert E. Lee as I was walking, I was shaking my head, seeing that. First thing you could do is get a new inscription under that statue. That would be is that Stonewall Jackson too? Whoever it is, you can get a new inscription. That would be like a really, really good start. Something that's easy that just should be done. But anyway, it was not like like today we view it as a sort of disgrace. That's not how enslavement was viewed at the time. Right. When the South seceded from this country, they did so like bustily, boldly, declaring themselves that enslavement was the foundation of the greatest civilization ever and the greatest institution kissed by God. That was how people thought about it. And so the idea that all these elite, universities, sort of have ties in this is not particularly remarkable if you can think about it from that perspective. It actually just makes sense. Now, that's not an excuse. That's not an excuse. I think Johns Hopkins, like any other institution, like, in America, that has roots in that times, which is basically ultimately every institution in this country, has a responsibility to see that, squarely. I'll leave it to the experts to point out how precisely that should be done here. And the second question over here was about defeatism. Young people today have no right to feel defeated by some videos. I know. Not at all. I mean, you just don't have the right. As I outlined, earlier when I was talking about African American history in this country, is the long history of struggle and not seeing success in your lifetime, but struggling nonetheless in the face of truly much more horrendous things than what you saw in video happen in Oregon. And that was just what enslavement was all the time. Right. That was just what it was. And people struggled, nonetheless. You just have no right. I mean, if Ida B. Wells can struggle, so can you. So I have no tolerance for the notion that people get to look at TV and feel defeated. It's ridiculous. You have no right. You have no right.
So we're going to take the last two questions from this mic here.
Hi, you've critiqued some of the options of, for-profit prisons and ending the drug war and cameras as being too small scale and not really addressing the whole solution. But beyond talking about plunder and white supremacy, you haven't really addressed the larger macro scale issue of socioeconomic class and how racism is an essential component of capitalism and systems of inequality. So how do you just think about what can we do in Baltimore, what can we do one issue at a time, when the whole system is built on taking from some so others may profit?
Next question.
Okay, so being a servant leader, community activist, selfless person that I am, I just have a quick question, and that is, will you take my folder?
I guess
Mr. Coates.
Okay. You bring your folder up, please. I'll make this. Come on, bring it up.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you. I now have your
folder. Do I inspect it? Okay, no. All right.
There's not no anthrax.
Okay.
Last question.
Oh, we got
Everyone's complete after.
Okay.
Briefly.
Thank you very much. My question comes from the logic of a presentation that was given at a strategy meeting that happened on Tuesday at the Real.
A little louder for folks in the back.
So, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle organized a strategy session and came up with a short-term goal for their objectives, which was to specifically point out that members of the state legislature, Mike Brown, Mike Bush, Valaro, Dumais, and Zirkin. Those were the names that they came up with to specifically apply pressure at the level that would fundamentally change policing in Baltimore. I'm curious if there is a list of names specifically that might be useful places for housing discrimination, identifying who is in a position of authority that can meaningfully be accessed. I understand that expertise is the
well,
question.
you can start with the Supreme, John Roberts, because right now the 1968 Housing Act is up before the Supreme Court. And the 1968 Housing Act is probably the most aggressive of all of the civil rights laws passed. It's the only one that allows you to actually, God, I'm so tired, I'm losing what the name of the principle actually is, but it's the only one that allows you to go in and look at the basic makeup and say this is discrimination. It's called affirmative something or other. I can't remember what it's called. But it's very, very different. You don't have to sit back and wait. In order to get federal funds, theoretically, because the law has never been enforced, in the way that it should be, it contains within it the engine to be most aggressive about, around, the issue that is so important to us. If the Housing Act gets struck down, we enter into like a second era of post-Reconstruction. It will be bad. Yeah. It will be really, really bad because it's not been as enforced as it should have been. And if it's gone, we're in trouble. You can expect everything to get worse. Segregation will get worse, and all the manifold effects that come out of segregation will get worse. There was a question over here about yes. So the idea was that racism and white supremacy are issues that exist underneath of this greater issue of class and capitalism. And I think I actually fundamentally disagree with that. I actually think white supremacy and racism are macro issues. I think it may well be the macro issue in America. It is foundational. There is no America without white supremacy. And I think that's like really, really important. It is the broader thing. And I don't know that, I know this is like a popular line. Well, it's true that, capitalism in the West, capitalism, here, is fundamentally inseparable from white supremacy and from racism. I don't know that if we got rid of capitalism that you necessarily automatically get rid of racism. I think that, if you looked at, for instance, the history of plunder, under Stalin, in Eastern Europe, you can see the same sort of ethnic divisions where people are chopped up in certain ways and certain people get things and other people, don't get things. The idea of plunder is, in fact, if you want to take it back, is older than white supremacy. It's actually, older than that. And so I think, if you want to say that's the big macro issue, how do we get people to stop taking things from other people? Well, that's the great issue of our time. I don't know that. I'll plead ignorance on that one. I'll plead ignorance on that one. I can, focus on this, small sort of aspect of it. One day maybe we'll get that solved and get to that Star Trek era, where there's no money and everything.
Right. Well, join me, please.
Thank you. Thank you.
As much of a pleasure it is to have this conversation today, I think as many of our questioners pointed out, our work is now ahead of us. It's still to come. And one of the things that we obviously can do in a university setting is take more classes, summer classes. I'm offering a civil rights summer class, actually, this year. I think I have 2 students enrolled. But even more than that, a steady diet of historical scholarship, a willingness to grapple with uncomfortable questions, and to not hide behind our own guilt. I think if there's anything that came out today, it's that being guilty about where you went to school or where you live or what you look like is not actually going to be what leads you forward. You have to be brave enough to look at the issues and to stare them in the face and to pick up the Atlantic from time to time and read an article by Ta-Nehisi Coates. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.